Thank you, Ingrid, and good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I was rewarded. I haven't been to Glenties before, and flew into Carrickfinn last night and was rewarded with a very spectacular, because it was very clear and Errigal was very clear. So it is everything that the Lonely Planet and all the guidebooks say. So it was, before I ever got here, I'd already had that pleasure. So I am, delighted to be invited. I was slightly, as I say, intimidated by people who were doing a lot of the crunching of numbers in relation to that. But what I would like to do over the next short while is maybe on behalf of the 600,000 workers that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions represents north and south, is give some expression to the lived experience, I suppose, of those people and the ambition that the Congress would have in relation to this term fiscal space and what might happen. But I also want to maybe expand that notion and set out an ambition of ICTU about what that should be and how it should be expanded. But I will happily identify areas where that expansion of finance might take place. From my own perspective as General Secretary of the INTO, I took up that position in 2009. So for many years I knew nothing, only recommending that my members should vote for deals that cut their pay. So there was a degree of irony in the organisation that the first time that money was coming back, because in Haddington Road and Lansdowne Road there was $1 billion been taken out of the economy, and I was highly recommending that people voted for it, and they did. So now I find myself in the ironic position where money is coming back and we're recommending no, but we can talk about that later. So just by way of context then, I think it's always worth repeating the fact of the impact of the cost of the economic collapse and the benefits of any ongoing recovery have not been shared fairly across groups, sectors or regions in Ireland. And workers in particular paid, and some continue to pay, an enormous price in terms of the jobs that were lost and the incomes that were reduced. And while I think it's clear that there is some plateauing out of living standards, but essentially it's property prices, corporate profits and equity returns that are really leading the way in the recovery. And while many have borne the brunt of the downturn, it's clear to us in the Congress of Trade Unions that few are reaping the rewards of the upswing. And much has been said about the casualties and the consequences of how we've dealt with the recent crash. But I think the most numerous and prominent amongst the casualties and consequences are the full-blown housing emergency, the significant infrastructure deficits in transport, in broadband, don't have to tell people here, renewable energy, childcare and water, and then the substantial pressure points in delivering frontline public services, and particularly, as Peter has mentioned, in health and education. I think it's fair to say in a debate like this that we all recognise that not a single budget can deal with all of these challenges. But I do think it's really important that Budget 18 begins to be the first in a series of budgets that begins to address them and begins to have a shift in direction. And that we need to direct the budgetary policy to tackle the deficits that we face in housing, in health, in education and in childcare, so that we can begin to lay again a really good foundation for a more dynamic economy and a fairer society if we want to see these investments both for the future and for the present. And so in the context of all of these infrastructural deficits outlined, I think the key question is, further income and capital gains tax cuts don't really make either moral or economic sense at this point in time, and we believe it will slow progress towards sustainable public finances and simply are not affordable. So the Irish Congress of Trades Union believes that a very different Ireland is possible based on a fairer distribution of income, on efficient public services and on a dynamic enterprise economy. And the Nevin Economic Research Institute has been projecting, I think, the growth of over 4% in 2017 and 3% in 2018. No doubt then that the increasing employment and the rising average disposable incomes will generate additional revenue flows for government. And that obviously in consequence we will see that deficit reducing. But as of last month, there is a fiscal space, as we know, of about 350 million for use in Budget 2018, after accounting for the recent public service pay agreement. But what the Irish Congress of Trade Unions has done, and spent some time doing it in terms of its view of how the budget might look like, it's proposing a significant increase through revenue-raising measures, and I'll come to those at the conclusion, raising it significantly to a 1.65 billion and adding the fiscal space to 2 billion. And this amount, which would represent about 2.5% of current total government spending, should be reused to rebuild economic, social infrastructure in education, in health, in transport. And it should not be seen as an optional extra. Because if we have a no policy change by 2021, we will have the lowest public spending to GDP in the EU. And such a low level of spending has serious implications for the future provision of public services, national infrastructure and the sufficiency of welfare payments, and could have significant societal and political consequences. And I think it is those societal consequences that we really have the responsibility to try to craft fairer solutions, fairer fiscal space. And if we were to identify, I think, the foremost challenge in all of that, it simply has to be the housing challenge. The number of, it's talked about a lot, but I think it's worth reciting again the figures, because really they are truly shocking, and we can become a bit desensitised, I think, to the scale of that emergency. The number of families in Dublin homeless for more than 2 years has just doubled in 8 months. Of the over 1,000 families in emergency accommodation at the start of June, 54 were homeless for 2 years or more. 133 were homeless for between 18 and 24 months. And the number of homeless for more than 6 months was 661, or 63%. So it's a crisis that we haven't really got to terms with. And in terms of those families, and this is something the members of my own union are really, really shocked at the kind of stories they're telling us about the experience of these children coming into our primary schools. There are over 2,500 children daily seeing the relentless strain and tension experienced by their parents. The teachers are seeing that strain coming into school. It's the lived reality of those pupils. They don't have a breakfast because the families don't have cooking facilities. They don't have a good night's sleep because whole families are sleeping in a room. And they know, the teachers are saying to us, we know this will impact on their prospects and their life chances. So the budget has to begin to wipe the stain of this policy failure and collectively from our social fabric. And it's not the first time that we've faced a housing crisis, but it is the first time that it has relied on a developer-led model that's not working. And Task has predicted that at the current rate of house building, it could take more than 40 years to provide the permanent homes that the people currently need on the housing waiting list. So we need a more radical change in relation to that. And ICTU is of the view that it can be done through a major local authority-led social housing programme providing stable, affordable tenure. I mean, it's interesting. Slogans like fair rent, fixity of tenure, free sale, ones we learned when we were studying for our Leaving Cert history, they have as much resonance today in 2017 as they did in 1879. So we need large-scale local authority housing projects to be delivered by the Irish government, as they did during the Depression in the 30s, the emergency in the 40s, and emigration in the 50s. Social housing policy must make affordable and secure rental accommodation available to a significant share of our population. And we have to increase the stock of homes in well-designed, sustainable neighbourhoods available to those on lower incomes. And the land and vacant houses should be acquired through compulsory purchase order. The vacant site levy should be brought forward immediately and pitched at a higher rate of 6% instead of 3%. And of course, the contested area of the sale of AIB shares, clearly the view of Congress is, we really, understanding that there is a debt, but we have a present, clear crisis right now that needs to be solved, and we need to start solving our housing and homeless emergency through funding a new social housing programme, and certainly that could provide the opportunity to do so. On the other important areas that might fall into what we would call the social wage or the social contract between the citizen and the state, certainly the area of health, and Peter has mentioned it, can only be possible if we move a good health system, if we move to an adequately funded, publicly controlled and universally accessible single-tier national health service. Of course it will require investment, and particularly looking at the demographics, where we're going to have to cope with, and it's probably an inappropriate phrase to use, support our ageing population. Given those demographic and technological pressures, we believe that the long-term target of 10% of GDP should be set for health spending. It will be a central challenge to keep people out of hospitals, keep long-term care where possible, investing in quality community health care. And the Oireachtas Sláinte report, I think it's a very welcome development, and much further work needed to identify where the expenditure can be increased. Education, an area dear to my own part, is very much far short in terms of spending, in terms of what's needed to equip children and students and workers with the skills that are going to be needed for the fast-changing world. And we need that education to be increased considerably. According to the OECD, the expenditure per student across all levels, primary, post-primary, third level, relative to our GPD, is amongst the lowest in Europe. And not only are our schools overcrowded and underfunded, but these areas like mental health services for young people, psychological services, speech and language services are very significantly compromised. So children only get one chance at school, and it must be top class. The per pupil funding needs to increase in real terms, and that's going to imply an increased spending per annum to ensure free compulsory education for all children. And again, we need to target a percentage. In our case, we're recommending a 7% of national income to be agreed in the medium term. A further huge infrastructural deficit is in the area of childcare. Our failures in the area of childcare can be remedied by raising investment to European levels, and obviously a number of important steps have begun to be taken in recent years. But it remains a major barrier to labour market entry and contributes to the loss of high-quality skills, experience and knowledge in the workforce. And we're proposing in Budget 2018 to expand publicly provided and subsidised childcare. Our annual childcare spend is amongst the lowest in the EU, so the average Irish family is spending about 30% of household income on childcare, which is about double the European average. This initiative or a measure would increase the social wage to families, and given that employers benefit from would benefit from the reduced childcare costs by a higher labour force participation, where ICTU has recommended that the PRSI rate on salaries in excess of 100,000, the rate should be increased to help hypothecate and raise the funds to increase state spending on childcare. Finally, in terms of protecting the vulnerable, many of the austerity cuts affecting young people, pensioners, lone parents should be reversed. These were the cuts imposed during the austerity years. We're arguing that welfare payments should be increased in the budget by a higher percentage than projected increases had been. It will help insulate vulnerable groups in Irish society from worsening deprivation and poverty. ICTU has consistently campaigned to achieve a living wage as a minimum for all workers and want the hourly rate of the minimum wage to be increased to the rate of a living wage, the hourly minimum wage to go up to $11.50. We're looking to address income reduction for workers entering retirement and increasing job seekers' benefit. In line with support from a transition to a zero and low carbon economy, ICTU accepts that such a transition will have consequences for workers in the energy sector, but proposed the creation of a retraining and upskilling fund to provide workers with the skills necessary to thrive in that context. There is no doubt, and again Peter has mentioned it, that Brexit poses a huge risk to the Irish economy, especially if it involves a departure from the customs union and the single market. And so ICTU would argue that we need to begin a process of retraining and upskilling workers, especially in sectors that are vulnerable to Brexit. We need to invest in transport hubs to tackle diversified trade flows, and we need to increase public capital spending from its current low level of 2% of national income to 4% within 3 years, and should be funded through a combination of flexible borrowing within the medium-term fiscal arrangements with joint ventures with the European Investment Bank. I suppose at the end of all of this, it's important, having laid out a fairly ambitious agenda, to identify from the perspective of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, how can you expand fiscal space? The amount of money that government have identified is so small it couldn't possibly achieve any of the ambition that I've set out. But we have done a lot of work in consultation with the Nevin Institute around revenue raising measures, recognising that an economy or a society can only flourish with sustainable and sufficient progressive taxation system. And while high-income households will need to contribute more in the future, it is important we avoid the mistakes of recent past by resisting calls to undermine the tax base. So what is politically expedient sometimes is neither economically sound or morally justifiable. So overall taxation has to be increased over time in order to pay for a growing and ageing population, to eliminate the existing underspends in various areas of public spending, such as education and infrastructure, and to meet the challenges. And so some of the measures we have set out under capital taxes, that there should be a minimum of 180 million raised through the reform of capital taxes and tax expenditures. Particular attention should be paid to those reliefs available at the marginal rate and the suite of reliefs related to inheritance and gift tax. A small wealth tax should be introduced, focusing on households with net assets in excess of £1 million. And it should aim to collect about 275 million in net additional revenue during 2018. On social insurance, at least 150 million should be raised by increasing the employer PRSI rate to 13.75% on incomes in excess of 100,000, and by targeting employer PRSI contributions on just that portion of the salary above 100,000 would affect relatively few employments and would not affect the marginal rate on employee salaries. On income taxes, we propose that Budget 2018 should introduce an income taxation reform so that the personal tax credit is gradually withdrawn from higher income earners and entirely eliminated for those with incomes in excess of 100,000. We argued that this would avoid labour market disincentive and raise an additional 120 million. The value-added tax in relation to the hospitality sector is an issue that the Irish Congress of Trade Union has been making a considerable amount of noise on for the last two budgets, and we're very happy to hear that this has been echoed by a number of commentaries. The government should remove the temporary VAT reduction for the hospitality sector. It was estimated to cost 2.1 billion over 4 years, and that was at the end of 2015. A conservative estimate of annual revenue is likely to, in 2017 is likely to be in excess of 700 million. We say that given the significant recovery in tourism numbers and the activity in the sector since 2011, and the case for retaining the tax is very weak. Recent times have seen a substantial increase in profits in many areas of accommodation and food services sector. And even still, according to the latest CSO statistics, 3 out of 4 workers in that sector are still earning less than €400 per week in 2014. Other tax reforms would be the income tax rebate incentive Help to Buy for the first-time buyers should be abolished, and that would yield 50 million. It's a wasteful use of public money and only increases house prices to benefit the seller. The money should be given to the local authorities as part of a housing to deal with the housing supply strategy that I spoke about earlier. Resources should be further increased to tackle the taxation of non-compliance at a yield of 50 million, and Budget 2018 should also amend the vacant site levy so that the rate increases from 3% to 6%. All of these measures would raise an additional 1.65 billion, bringing fiscal space to 2 billion for Budget 2018. It could, of course, be more if bold decisions based on long-term sustainability were made. However, that's probably for another day. In conclusion then, I think at the end of the day what we need to have is to broaden and lengthen the discussion and have an honest conversation about all forms of taxation in Ireland in the long term. Because questions arise about our ability to defend our international reputation indefinitely on a global corporate tax avoidance front. Can we continue to try to have lower taxes on income or capital than our EU colleagues? Can we continue a relatively light corporation policy at the expense of households? Can we simplify indirect taxes such as VAT and excise? Can we even discuss the topic of carbon taxes, given our success with water and waste charges? Finally, rather than overthinking each year's budget and talking about what are relatively small changes in each individual budget, is it ever possible for us to have a mature, evidence-based debate about reshaping Ireland's taxation over a 10-year period? In that context, then we might be talking about a total fiscal space of maybe even up to something about €1 trillion. Now, that might be a fiscal space well worth discussing.